Because if you look at a province,
say family, say community, say district, say province. Say family, say community, say district, say province.
Taiona moto marongera vanoita wepanyika vanoda kuti isu vamwe tioneswe moto dai pasina kupindira kwaishe yechokwadi pasi pano taiona moto marongera vanoita wepanyika.
Welcome to this edition of The Situation Right Now, proudly brought to you in partnership with Kotrad from Masvingo. Now, in this edition, we're going to be locating the people. We're going to be finding the role that the people of Zimbabwe play in the disbursement and use of devolution funds. Now, just a few weeks ago, President Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa announced that his government released $2 billion Zimbabwean dollars to devolution, and he said that this money is going to provinces, to councils, to ensure that they operationalize the devolution clause in the constitution. And there's been concern on how does government decide where and who to give how much. There's also been concern on how the people are involved. If the people are involved, how do we locate the people? Because when you talk about devolution, you talk about people deciding what to do with their resources. So how are the people consulted, and how do the people find their voice in the spending of this $2 billion that government has released for devolution funds? Now, first of all, we're going to hear from the Minister of State and Devolution from Midlands Province, who's going to be telling us the operationalization or how the money goes into councils from central government and who decides from the policy level. And then we're going to have a segment where we are going to interrogate these issues that the minister has raised with my partners from civil society to find out exactly if this is what is happening on the ground. Now, this is the situation right now, and I am Dara Blessed Mhlanga. So, thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for joining us on this program. Now, Minister, just recently, President of Zimbabwe, President Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, announced that the government had released close to $2 billion in devolution monies. Now, just wanted to find out from you as Minister of State and Devolution how that money comes into the provinces and how you decide what to use it for.
Thank you very much. I believe that if we have the time, it is important to let viewers know and understand what devolution is all about and what it means. It is the topical word right now, but I think a lot of people, some people also have a misunderstanding in terms of what devolution is about. Well, devolution is the decentralization of power from national government to provincial government and to the local authority. And this is something that is promulgated in our constitution. something that has to be done. And the government has to ensure that at least 5% of its revenues are set aside for disbursement to provinces and down to the local authorities through a mechanism which is accountable and which shows that indeed the funds are used for the purposes which they are intended to be used. Yes, the President, His Excellency, Comrade Idi Mnangagwa, announced that so far to the provinces for onward transmission to the local authorities out of a budgeted figure of $19.2 billion for this fiscal year. So how does this money get transferred? How does it reach lowest person, lowest level? I think that was basically your question. The money is, first of all, calculated by the Ministry of Finance together with Ministry of Local Government and Public Works, which is responsible for the local authorities, using a WHO-approved formula on marginalization. Because if you look at a province, metropolitan province like Harare, it is not the same as Midlands province in terms of infrastructure, in terms of development, in terms of number of people, in terms of marginalization. So this formula takes into consideration population densities, the size of the province, the infrastructure that is in that area, how many schools are there, primary schools, secondary schools, clinics, roads, the extent of the roads, and so forth. Once that is agreed, the next thing that happens is that each province is then allocated a certain amount of money. And that is disbursed as and when the Ministry of Finance accumulates funds and directs those funds to the provinces through direct transfers to the local authorities. The local authorities, in turn, are expected to have compiled their own budgets. If I can give you an example, for instance, the Shawane Runde Rural District Council, which is the lowest level in the governance structure, would have said this year we want to spend so much money, maybe let's say 100 million, broken down as follows: clinics, roads construction, electrification, schools, and water, sanitation. So when the disbursement occurs, it goes directly to the local authority. And when I say the local authority, it could be an urban local authority, such as here in the Midlands, we have Kwekwe City Council, we have Gweru City Council, we have Shawane Town Council, and or it could go to a rural district council, which is the same, but in a rural setting. And the needs are different, as you can tell, that the needs of the people in Gweru City Council, for instance, are very different from the needs of the people in Shirugwi Rural District Council, Tongo Gardu Rural District Council, or in Zishawane or Mberengwa. But in answer to your question, the money goes directly to the local authority. And my job particularly, and together with the local authority, is to ensure that prior to the receipt and use of the money, that the appropriate stakeholders have been consulted as to what they would want in their area to be developed.
When you say the appropriate, yeah, when you say the appropriate stakeholders, what exactly do you mean?
I'm talking about the common man. Basically, let's start off with the rural setting. You have a village in a specific area. That village has a village head, and you have a VIDCO, what we call a VIDCO, which is the Village Development Committee. The Village Development Committee will sit down and say, look, our borehole is no longer functioning. It's no longer yielding the amount of water that we need, because maybe we have increased households. So we would like to have another borehole sunk here. From the Village Development Committee, it will go up to the Ward Development Committee, or called, otherwise known as the WADCO. Then the WADCO is an agglomeration of all the village VIDCOs put together and their needs. And in this case here, the councillor for the ward would then put up all the projects that are needed. There may not be a clinic in that ward. And that is the situation right now. You find other wards that don't have clinics. They have to move, they have to walk 10, 15 kilometers to get to the nearest clinic. And from the ward, it then goes up to the district, and that's the full council now, that then looks at all the wards in that particular constituency, in that particular district, and says, what are the needs? When they look at those needs, one would expect that also, first of all, after the village head would have consulted with the traditional leaders, your headmen, the chiefs, to say, this is what we need in this area for development to progress. So yeah, those are the stakeholders.
How do you deal, Minister? How do you deal with mischievous councils? Like, for instance, we have had in other cases where councils have taken that money and started paying salaries.
Well, yeah. First of all, I think it depends with the level of mischievousness that would have happened. What will generally happens is that a commission of inquiry is sent to go and ascertain the level of mischievousness or abuse of the funds. That commission of inquiry will then come back with the report and say, look, we've been to such and such council and we found out that instead of spending money on the items specifically stated in the Constitution, they've gone ahead and spent the money on other things, such as, for instance, buying boardroom furniture. We've had a situation where a local authority bought boardroom furniture for itself, and instead of dealing with issues related to water, sanitation, or health. So once the Commission of Inquiry has come up with this report, we then consult with the Ministry of Local Government and Public Works and make recommendations as to what charges should follow. But at the end of the day, the local council is still responsible for reimbursing that money back to the devolution account in their local authority. We don't allow them to get away with it. If you have spent $500,000 buying boardroom furniture when you should have drilled a borehole. We still expect you to get $500,000 from your other revenue accounts, which have nothing to do with devolution, and put that money back in. And of course, we would follow up and to see who authorized that. How did that happen? Was it an individual activity that occurred, or was it the full council that authorized that expenditure in the wrong manner? If it is an individual, that individual is charged and subject to dismissal and or imprisonment if they pocketed the money. If it is full council that has done that, then the Minister of Local Government and Public Works would then decide what course of action to take. One that is quite obvious is that the full council would be required to refund the money to the devolution account through their other means of collecting money, their revenue collections, the rates, the taxes that they charge people, to put it back into the proper account within a specified period of time. But should there be a situation where there was gross abuse lingering on fraud, then the appropriate agencies are brought in, such as Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission or the police themselves, to investigate whether those offenses are offenses that should be levied upon them collectively.
But Minister, if someone would say that ministers of state and ministers of devolution are in charge of those funds, would it be a correct statement?
Well, look, it is a correct statement, but up until the passage of Constitutional Amendment Bill number 1 and 2, there was really no mechanism through which we could control those funds. But now that that has been passed, the appropriate acts are being finalized that will make us truly responsible for the funds, where money will be transferred to the Midlands Provincial Council. Then the Provincial Council would see to it that that money now goes to each and every local authority underneath it. So that is in process, and we hope that fairly soon we will be able to have direct control of those funds that would have been allocated for our province.
But so as at present, how does the money eventually reach the local authority? Does it come direct from central government to the local authorities, or it comes to the Minister of Devolution and then you allocate it? How does it get to? No.
I've already addressed this question when I was talking about the WHO formula that determines how much each province and then each local authority is supposed to get. And I did indicate that the money is transferred from central government directly to the local authority.
So you don't touch it?
That is actually in the Blue Book. If you take this year's Blue Book, you will find that Gweru City Council is supposed to be getting so much money. Mm-hmm. So when the time comes for disbursements, central government disburses that money directly to the local authority. At the moment, it does not come through my office or through the provincial councils, because remember, the provincial councils haven't been sworn in yet. Once they're sworn in, then they have their own structures where now the ministers of state for provincial affairs and devolution will now have a say to say, look, how are the budgets coming up? Why is Gokwe South getting such little money in terms of road maintenance, whilst Churumanzu is getting a lot more money? What is the logic and reasoning behind that?
So at the present moment, your role is purely oversight.
Correct. It's oversight in terms of determining what would have happened to the money transferred to a local authority, and to see if indeed that money was used for what it was intended for. And if not, then we initiate investigations as to what happened.
Miss, I just wanted you to maybe lastly, just to explain the advantages of the amendments, the constitutional amendments that came through. What are the basic advantages or disadvantages, if they are there, of those amendments for in operationalizing devolution?
The one significant advantage is that the provincial councils will now be sworn in. And as you know, in each province, there's about 10 members of the provincial council that sit in there. The CEOs of the rural district councils also sit in the provincial councils. What has been removed is the members of parliament no longer sit in there. The senators no longer sit in there. So you have a situation where the advantage being the provincial council being independent and being able to coordinate the activities of each local authority underneath the provincial council, and determining, which there are at the moment, the projects that should be placed under devolution. So I think that sort of independence is a huge advantage. And then also you have the provincial council now overseeing the activities of the individual local authorities. At the moment, it's just my office that has that responsibility, but we will now empower the provincial councils to oversee the activities of the local authorities as well.
So where will you fit? Where will you fit in as Minister of State and Devolution? Will you be in the provincial council, or you be outside the provincial council? How will it work?
Look, the provincial councils, by far and large, other than having oversight over the funds that are disbursed to the local authorities, they also act as a legislative body, where they might say, for instance, we need to raise some funding through a tax or an ordinance. Ordinance is the correct word, to address a specific problem in a local authority. And as to where do I stand, my role is to initiate devolution in the province, devolution programs in the province. So I work together with the provincial councils to say, look, I think we are behind in this specific area. I think we need to focus on this specific area. And maybe even get to the point where we say, you have put too much money in schools, for instance. I'm not saying we have enough schools, but for a very long time, we've been focusing on schools. But we're now getting to a point where we're saying, why don't we get to a point where we have piped water going to the villages? That's what uplifts the standards of living for people. That's what gets us to Vision 2030, where people don't have to walk 2-3 kilometers to go to Borani. We're saying we must now modernize ourselves. And I also represent the president in the province. I look after all the programs that are initiated by central government. Every ministry that is represented at provincial level, the provincial heads report to me in terms of the programs that they are having. And I also look at that and do a report at the end of every month to His Excellency, itemizing the progress made by each specific ministry. So my role is to coordinate the entire governmental activities within the province.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, just the last time I spoke to you, Minister, your province didn't have sufficient food supplies. But now we had been blessed by a bit of some good rains. Maybe just for information's sake, people who are listening, what is your food situation like in the Midlands, and will you be able to survive this season?
No, thank you very much, Blessed. I'm happy and glad to report that, yes, this season, we will not need to import any food from outside of the province. It does not mean that all districts performed well. We do have districts such as Mberengwa, certain parts of Mberengwa, Zishawane and Shurumanzu, that did not produce because of too much rain, actually. But all the other districts produced enough food to allow us to redistribute that food to the districts that don't have enough food, and still keep some in our strategic reserves.
No, thank you very much.
So we're okay.
Thank you very much, Minister. And as always, I wish you the best in the work that you're doing. I know you travel across the length and breadth of Midlands, trying to make sure that you coordinate everything and it gets well. But I in your parting shots, this would be your last words. I'm not going to ask you a question, but I would want you to address to address the province, to address people who have doubts in devolution, to give them your assurances and knowledge of what is going to work and how it's going to work.
First of all, I think as I started, I explained devolution, and then you went on further to ask as to who precisely are those stakeholders, and I said it's the common man. My message to Midlanders is that they should get hold of their local authorities and be able to participate as and when discussions are made in as far as use and application of devolution funds. I am sure that our people know who their councillors are. I'm sure people know who their village heads are, who their chiefs are, and they know who their MPs are, and those are the people that they should consult. or go straight to the local authority office and say, here is my contribution in as far as what should be done with devolution funds. Remember, devolution funds are funds that come from the people themselves. They don't come from outside of the country. We don't have any grants. We don't have anybody giving us that money. This is money that is collected when you pay your 2% intermittent financial tax, when you go and pay your VAT, when you pay your pay as you earn. That's where the money for devolution comes from. So it's your money, and you have a right to know how your money is used when it comes back to you as devolution, as funds from devolution. And any projects that are made, that are embarked on, should be branded as such. If a local authority builds a clinic, I believe it should be able to say this clinic was built using funds from the devolution program. If they buy equipment for road maintenance, they should state that this grader was bought using funds from the devolution program, so that people know that devolution works, that devolution is there, and that they also have a right to input their ideas into the devolution program. It is not a program that is designed by councillors alone. It is not a program that is designed by management of the local authorities alone, but collectively, it is our program. It is everyone's program. So I would want Midlanders to understand that we would have received all of the money that we would have received by now, but because of COVID, the funds had to be channeled elsewhere so that we are able to import the drugs and other requirements such as PPE in order to stop the rapid infection of the COVID-19 virus.
So in studio to discuss these issues here, I'm supposed to have been joined by Dr. Mavetera from the MDCT, and I'm sure he is on his way, or he's going to come. But I'm also joined here in studio by Tapiwa from the Local Governance Trust. Tapiwa, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm also joined by, you know, when I interacted with the name, it was amazing, Chira. But thank you very much, Tinotenda Chira, for joining us. Tinotenda is from the Institute of Young Women Development. Thank you very much, and welcome to Heart and Soul TV and Radio.
Thank you very much for having me.
Beautiful. Now, I'll start with you, Chira. The aspect of devolution, a lot of people, you know, we are still debating this, trying to find exactly what devolution means and where do we locate the people. But from what has been happening so far since the 2013 Constitution, which spoke specifically to devolution, do you see, as young women in leadership, in development, do you see people being located in developing their own communities?
Thank you very much for that question. And I'll say my surname is quite the conversation starter always. What I will say is that it is critical for us to appreciate what is devolution to begin with. It is not a delegation of powers where you have the lower aspects of government being washed on what they do. It's supposed to be a transfer of those powers, autonomous powers. And devolution means that the lower tiers of government will have political power, legal power, financial power, administrative power. So it's the power to make decisions, to implement decisions, to make laws, to raise funds, and to actually make decisions on how those funds must be used. And I will tell you that in our experience as the Institute, we work with women, particularly in marginalized areas. And most of them do not even understand what devolution is. That is the young women. And you also find that most of, for example, the councillors, etc., they do not understand either. Is it delegation? Is it transfer? What is it? So the first point of call is for people to understand what devolution is, because you cannot ask about what you don't understand. So there's a big information gap there.
Yeah. Now, but already we have seen funds being allocated. The President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, said that 2 billion of it has been allocated to local authorities, and here there's an information gap on what is devolution. Now, do you even understand, or do you know how those funds have been channeled and how they're being used?
That's a very interesting question. And I'll take you back to the framework that we have. Firstly, we have Chapter 14 of our Constitution that speaks to devolution, right? And then we have a circular of 2019 that speaks to devolution. And then we have a devolution and decentralization policy. Now, what you will see here is the Constitution is a guide. It's a supreme law of the land, but it does not operationalize the devolution in itself to say who is supposed to do what. So that is the biggest loophole. To say, yes, funds have been given to councils. Who is councils? Who exactly? Who is supposed to do what? At what time? Who has what duty? What obligation? What are the remedies if someone does not do what they do? And I'll give a very good example of Nkai Road District Council. They were given funds which they never utilized, which just shows that when you go to their doorstep and say, why didn't you utilize them? The question is, who are you going to ask? You cannot ask the building, you have to ask someone. So the problem is we do not have specifics on who is supposed to do what at what time. We do not even have specifics on when the councils are supposed to receive the funds. They seem to receive them at very random times each year. So these are some of the problems.
Mm-hmm. I'll come to you, Tabi. And she raises the issue of loopholes and lack of laws, because an enabling act would have been specific to say devolution funds move in this manner. But let's start from the 2 billion. Where does it? How do we arrive at the 2 billion? And the Minister of State, Larima Vima, says that that 2 billion is allocated to provinces and councils using a formula that gives more money to the most underprivileged communities and lesser money to those that have a bit of some money. So, for instance, Gokwe Kana would actually receive more money than Harare would do because of the per capita aspect.
Thank you very much, Blessed. And I think this is a very important subject, and it is coming at a very opportune time. I think from the onset, I think one of the things we need to recognize is that these monies that are called the devolution funds have started trickling down. Since 2013 up to 2018, we have not had any of these disbursements. Yet this is a constitutional matter. Section 301 of the Constitution is very clear that 5% of national revenues have got to be distributed to provincial and local authorities. So the Constitution is directing the minister responsible for finance to disburse 5% of the national revenues to the subnational local authorities. But for purposes of clarity, Blessing, I will use the term intergovernmental fiscal transfers as opposed to devolution funds, because that is where the confusion is. We have, in the Section 301, which is financial management in the Constitution, says that there will be a 5% that is disbursed. But there is mention of what we call conditional grants and unconditional grants. And our view is that the 5% that is distributed to provincial and local governments have got to be unconditional grants. In other words, these unconditional grants have got to be appropriated from the Consolidated Revenue Fund and distributed to local authorities using the enabling act that you talked about. The challenge that we have at the moment is that we do not know the formula that is used for disbursing of these resources, which is a key handicap. Whilst we've celebrated the trickling down of these 5% funds, we have gotten back to Ministry of Local Government, Ministry of Finance, to the national government and said we need an enabling act. An enabling act where we have a formula, and the formula should be simple, should be predictable, and be very clear in terms of who is getting what when, picking up from what Chiera was saying. So the absence of a clear formula at the moment, the absence of a predictable formula at the moment is the key handicap. We need to know in November of 2019 the amounts that are going to be expected by provincial and local authorities in Nkai, I come from Rewa, I grew up in Nyajena and Rengo Mine. So these monies have got to be known so that these communities are able to plan for these resources in the ensuing year. So in 2022, we should be knowing in October or November when the budget statement, the national budget statement is delivered in terms of how much is going to where. So that is the biggest challenge that we have at the moment.
But in your statement, you moved from devolution funds, and you bring in an interesting aspect that these are not devolution funds. Chiera spoke about financial independence in devolution when we implement devolution. Now, how do we match that mismatch?
I think Chiera was I think clear in terms of a understanding of devolution. That devolution is encompassing a fiscal devolution at some point. So the Constitution envisaged that these lower tier structures or these subnational local authorities, which are provincial and local, have got to have resources so that they can have communities determine their own destiny. So there's no contradiction there. But what is important is that blessing, which is very critical, is that we have two things here. We have, and I'm using the broader term of inter-governmental fiscal transfers, right? And I'm saying there are conditional grants and unconditional grants. For purposes of clarity, when we talk about conditional grants, when we have a cholera outbreak in Gweru, and government or the national government steps in with the $100,000 to alleviate the cholera outbreak in Gweru, and they give them $100,000 to cure that. Those are conditional grants. And in this instance, our view is that those cannot be classified as devolution funds. Devolution funds have got to be unconditional. In other words, the Constitution says 5% of the national revenues have got to be distributed to provincial and local authorities. In other words, the devolution funds, as it were, would seem as if they are top down. You mentioned Minister Jidau's statement, which is it Minister Mavima? I keep coming back to the Harare one. Minister Mavima. What we are seeing at the moment is that there seems to be a prescription from the center, from the national government, in terms of how these devolution funds have got to be utilized. Yet these devolution funds have got to be unconditional. And if any other resources are going to be distributed to these local authorities, they can be distributed outside of the bracket of the 5%. Now, this is possible because we do not have an enabling act. We need an enabling act that then specifies to say we need this amount of money to be distributed to local authorities. So that is the explanation, that we have what we call intergovernmental fiscal transfers, which comprise of conditional grants and unconditional grants. But the Constitution is very clear in Section 3012 that the 5% should be distributed to local authorities. It is the Constitution that is directing the executive. So whoever becomes the executive should clearly allocate 5% to provincial and local governments.
Mm-hmm. Now, In this setting where there is no law governing this and no specifics as to who do you talk to and how do you find accountability, what can the citizens do, because the money is already going, and how do they find voice in there?
I think that is a very good question. And while there has been an attempt to gazette the Provincial and Metropolitan Councils Administration Amendment Bill, that was gazetted on the 31st of March. And, well, looking at the history, it was only after there was litigation. And 8 years later, you have a bill that doesn't really locate the people within it. So what you will find is that when it comes to participating in the devolution agenda, the citizens have opted to using other channels that are there. For example, we know that we have our budget consultations annually. So during that meeting, that's when people those who know about it, get the chance to talk about how they want devolution funds to be used. But it ought not to be like that. It is like that because there is nothing that stipulates anything. And when nothing is stipulated, no one is responsible and nothing is done. So, for example, when it comes to, engaging the citizens, it ought to be clear when and how, who, where. So it's actually been very difficult. So you find that people bring the issue of devolution where it's not being asked about. Mm-hmm. And that is when you will find that at the end of the day, they will say, we consulted. But it was during another mainstream meeting. That was not supposed to be specific about devolution.
So Minister Mavima says the consultation happens, you come from the ward committee where the councillor, where there's a ward development officer, then you go, village development officer, then you go to the ward where there's the councillor, and then the councillor takes whatever is discussed from that ward, takes it to council chambers where they then make it a district aspect, and they make resolutions for district development as a council using those devolution funds. Does that make sense to you?
I think what doesn't make sense to me is to say, why isn't it written down? You see, there is a very big problem when things are not written down because no one is accountable. There are no checks and balances. You see, I did mention that there are pseudo consultations, as I would call them. But what then boggles the mind is, why isn't it mandatory? Because it appears that these consultations have become, whether you want to or not. It's better when we know that, the councillor is supposed to do 3 consultations with a quorum of this number of people. They are the minutes. This is how it happens. Because then what do we have? Accountability. Now, this situation where it's sporadic and very random and haphazard leaves everything to the discretion of that person in power, which then defeats the whole idea of devolution of powers.
Mm-hmm. Look, I want to, maybe I'll come to you and say, let's say people are consulted, and then they're not the ones who are making the budget either way. So you're consulted on what you want. Then after being consulted, you say we want to have a dam built here, but central government allocates you money that is not even sufficient for the dam. So is there really need for that consultation when you don't even know how much you're going to get at the end of the day?
Thanks, Blessed. I just want to pick from the last question and connect it with your with the question you've asked me and the response that Chiera gave. That I think there's no confusion here. Devolution funds are coming to an authority, and these authorities have already been in existence. We have 92 rural and urban local authorities. So this money that is disbursed is not being disbursed in the air. It is being disbursed to a local authority that is comprised of elected representatives who are your councillors and your appointed personnel officials who are your managers. So the accountability element is simple here, and I'm coming to your next question. That the consultation, like Minister Mavima says, has got to start from the ward level. And then there are ward development plans that are drawn, and those ward development plans are the basis for budgeting, right? And the devolution funds are coming in as a national augmentation resource, a financial resource to the funds that these local authorities are already raising. So these local authorities have been functioning since 1912 with resources raised locally. Now, what the Constitution in 2013 is saying is that the national government should then allocate an additional 5% of the national resources to these local authorities in order for them to deliver services better. So and what we are then advocating, Blessed, is that if we have a predictable formula, what then happens is that in 2022, when local authorities budget, we are in the budgeting season at the moment. In October, consultations have got to commence. So when they budget and when they eventually come up with their draft budget in December, they need to know that we are going to receive an extra $100 from the national government in order for them to plan better. So the accountability element is already laid down. We may need to enhance it. But what is critical at the moment is that we need to know the additional resources that we are going to get, and then from our words, we then say this is how we are planning for those additional resources that are coming from the national government.
Then no, because you're saying that we already have accountable structures. What then would be the role of the provincial council?
I think that is a very good question, which goes back to the constitutional making exercise. The provincial council, we have struggled to find a role for it, but we've struggled to find a role for it. But one of the people that have tried to convince me, they've said, and I'll give the example of Harare, that we want to build the Kunjwi Dam, for instance. Kunjwi Dam will not benefit Harare province alone. It will benefit Goromonzi, it will benefit Noton, it will benefit Epworth, it will benefit Chitungwiza, and so on. In doing that, perhaps the provincial council can then come in to coordinate projects or programs that are of a cross-cutting nature across the local authorities. I've mentioned 4 or 5 local authorities here. So the provincial councils can then come in to make sure that the province itself benefits or is able to develop from a provincial level. Although in another program, I can show you how provincial councils, because they do not deliver services, may not be necessarily essential in our local governance or a structure. So that's really my view, that and someone has convinced me this in our office, that we need provincial councils for that purpose.
But Chira, I want us to talk about, this aspect that has always been at the center of people who argue on devolution. That, for instance, we had diamonds in Marange, but the province is still as poor. But lots of money was taken out of that place. You have, in Kai, as you speak, you have serious teak wood, very expensive. But the people in there don't find the benefits of those things. Now, how does this devolution that has instructions from central government allocating resources from a certain 5% of national budget benefit or change this narrative?
I think while your question speaks to devolution, I also think you're indirectly speaking of corruption. Because you see, in as much as, say the diamonds did not benefit the people in Marange, My other question is who benefited from these? You know what I'm saying? At the end of the day, because devolution is so vague, it's a breeding ground for corruption. And the thing with corruption is, you know, people like to say, for example, then Tepo was corrupt, then he was arrested, then etc. But corruption is really, it's a symptom of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem usually is vagueness, is when things are not stipulated. I will go back to the issue of things not being written down. Because when things are not written down, there are no checks, there are no balances. And corruption is a methodology. It breeds on loopholes, cracks. And that is exactly what we have with devolution. So many cracks, so many loopholes. So I will not go necessarily to say this province did not benefit from its revenue. Because either way, which province did? And you also have to understand that it brings a bigger problem of corruption because nothing is stipulated. And that is a breeding ground.
Yeah, you spoke, the reason I'm coming to this is you spoke about financial independence to say that local authorities or actually that particular province should be able to also fund its own projects, to say, to raise money for, say, for a dam project and ensure that they use the resources from the, for their benefit. You would find some people in Wange, you know, pylons of electricity pass through the communities, and they don't have electricity. So how does devolution and also people managing to decide what to do with what they have and making budgets for themselves, how does this change the people's lives if we are going to have these things written down and then be specific to say this is what should be done?
Ordinarily, devolution is centered on development, economic development. So we will find that, yes, the provinces are supposed to benefit. And like Tapiwa highlighted, there is supposed to be a formula. And I'll go back, that is written down because people need to know about it. So now I do understand that the Minister of Finance did indicate that there is a formula based on infrastructure in a province, the population size, thriving of poverty. But the issue is that is as vague as it gets. If the formula is there, can it just be published in, I don't know, on Facebook, in the Financial Gazette, in the Government Gazette? If these things are there, as they are said to be, can they just be published? Because it's one thing to allege. When you allege that something is there, and then we go to the ground, we see that there are certain provinces that are thriving on poverty, even though the provinces are so rich in minerals. For example, Mashonaland Central has gold. But you will find that there is so much poverty that is affecting especially the ordinarily marginalized groups. So the issue is, can these things just be communicated to us as the citizens? Because now the formula being used becomes some sort of a secret. And now we wonder, why?
It's a sophisticated
Yes.
algorithm.
It really should be something where my grandmother can just look at and say, okay, this is how it's going. Because now you're alleging that something is there, that it's supposed to benefit the poorer provinces, but are going to the ground, the poorer provinces are getting poorer and poorer. Now when provinces get poorer, we must also not forget that the already marginalized groups like women, young women, people living with disabilities, children, become more prejudiced. And also in the devolution agenda, there was supposed to be an aspect that caters for quotas for these marginalized groups. And you will find that with the bill gazetted on the 31st of March, we cannot locate the people, neither can we locate the marginalized groups.
You spoke about conditional and unconditional funds. And there are some local authorities who have received this money, this devolution money, which you have given another name. And some of them have taken that money. They have paid outstanding salaries for council employees. Minister Mavima was saying that there's a local authority that used that money to buy boardroom furniture. And they have been instructed to retain that money because when that money comes, it's specifically for development. Now, how do we reconcile this aspect in terms of what you have said, conditional and non-conditional funds?
Thank you, Blessed. I think the first point is understanding equity and equality. The unconditional grants are supposed to, which we are calling the devolution funds, which JERA says we need a formula that is written down and that is predictable, that is simple, that is known. We need these unconditional grants to address the equity issue, right? In other words, the 5% using a certain formula should be distributed to the 102 provincial and local authorities. But there may be additional resources that may be distributed to these subnational governments, which are then called the conditional grants. The formula that she's talking about can include, and we've heard about this from Minister Honorable Mtulingwe, that the formula includes a poverty prevalence rate, the infrastructure prevalence rate, and so on and so on. Now, over and above the unconditional grants. So, in other words, Nkai has received $100 as devolution funds, isn't it? But there is still a problem in Nkai. What does the national government do? It then says, we are giving you an additional $20 as a conditional grant to address A, B, C, D. Where I have a problem, Blessed, is that the national government is prescribing that do not use this money for A, B, and C. What should be happening is that local authorities in the Midlands area should be determining with the people in that area in terms of what they want to use that money for. So, government cannot say, we want to use this money for water and sanitation in the Midlands. Why water and sanitation? When probably they want roads, when probably they want health care, when probably they want education. So, this is where we seem to be having a problem with the national government, that these funds should have an unconditional tag as opposed to a conditional tag, right? In order for communities, and this is prescribed in Chapter 14 of the Constitution, in the preamble, that devolution is going to come for communities to determine service priorities in their own areas, right? And then let me address the last part of your question around the misuse of these funds. Funds were being misused even before the devolution funds in 2019. Funds were being misused even before the 2013 Constitution. And they will continue to be misused even after we have a formula and that is written down. But the same Constitution has sufficient mechanisms and checks and balances to address the corruption issue. How? We have, at the moment, the Auditor General's report, and I'm coming from a meeting at the moment where the Auditor General's report for local authorities was being discussed. And one of the issues in there is how come some of these issues that are being raised by the Auditor General for local authorities, which is an independent board established by the Constitution, are not being addressed. So, we need to cure the corruption element in local authorities, whether we have devolution funds or not, by addressing the corruption elements using the structures and mechanisms that have been established by the Constitution. And I'm talking about the Auditor General's report, Madam Chiri's report at the moment. So the conversation that someone somewhere will need to come and make an audit of these devolution funds, or rather we are not going to disburse 5 billion to you because we think you misuse them. I think is a conversation that cannot be sustained. So that's my view, that let's use the mechanisms that are already in place in order for us to cure the corruption elements in the local authorities. At the moment, blessed, we have over 34 local authorities that do not have end of year statement. Some of them dating back as far as 5 years back. We do not know. And that has nothing to do with devolution. So certain elements, even if they bring in they bring them today, and we are told so and so misused the funds in 2002, what are you going to do? So we need to use the mechanisms that are already in the Constitution in order for us to make sure that there is development at the local level over and above the conversation about we have corruption this, we have corruption that.
I want to allow you, Chair, to give recommendations in closing. I know you have insisted on having something written down, but I want us to have a discussion as to how do we ensure that the people are located in this development. How do we ensure that someone who comes from Masvingo, where there is Hippo Valley, there's a lot of farming that is going on, sees the benefit of that sugar that everyone else in Zimbabwe is buying and feeding, instead of us seeing those benefits being enjoyed in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in Centon, when the person in Masvingo is hungry.
Thank you, Blessed. And I like that you grasped the point about writing things down. See, what I think about this discussion is it's incomplete if we do not emphasize on the need of enabling legislation. Because people generally like to adhere to things that have become prescribed and mandatory. I like how you just spoke of the council that bought desks instead of using the devolution funds for development as prescribed in the circular of 2019. And I like how you said they misused funds and they were instructed to give them back. That does not hold any water. Because if we had enabling legislation that criminalizes that misuse of funds, because, calling it misuse, in Shona would say, it's not misuse. And now when you say they were instructed to give it back, is it a suggestion? And then again, my question is, it's based on what? Because there is nothing written down. There is no enabling legislation. So my first recommendation is we need enabling legislation that prescribes who, when, what, by what time. And furthermore, that has penalties and checks and balances. And secondly, when we have this enabling legislation, the people that are elected into certain positions, like our councillors, our MPs, must have a key role that they play because they are said to be the voice of the people, as opposed to having people who are appointed in certain positions being the key custodians of the funds. So how we can locate ourselves as people is to have the people we elected in certain positions to be the custodians of these funds, to be the checks and balances of these funds. So enabling legislation, for me, we cannot run away from it, and it ought to be there. And secondly, we also need to depoliticize the devolution agenda. It has become a synonym for government change, for, other things. It does not mean. Yes. Because naturally, it's the transfer of powers, releasing power from one person to the next. Of course, it becomes political. But we also need to understand that it is really about development more than anything. And then another thing is we also need to locate the people who are historically prejudiced. And I will say this again, that, for example, the Provincial and Metropolitan Councils Act that was gazetted on the 31st of March does not tell us, anything about young women, children, people living with disabilities, people living with HIV and AIDS, and it ought to. So the key for me, the first one, is there has to be legislation. But this legislation must be after consultation with us, the people. What do we want to see? Because as at the 31st of March, we then found ourselves with a piece of legislation that does not speak to us as the people. That does not put us at the center. That comes up with a development committee that is supposed to have security agents, but somehow does not have women, does not have etc. So you will find that for me, legislation. Number one. And in as much as I would like to have a plethora of solutions, the first one for me is legislation that is informed by the needs and the wants of the people, that has checks and balances, and that has consequences, which do not call misappropriation of funds misuse, like it's a household thing. You just bought cooking oil instead of salt. It's not supposed to work like that, because you have abused funds that have been worked hard for by taxpayers. So when you then say, I then misused, really when you're talking about people and having development at the core of devolution, the word misuse should not be coming out there. And the words, we encourage you to return the funds, should not be coming up there.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Chiera. Chiera, thank you very much. Now I want you also to just give us your conclusions. I mean, picking also from Chiera the issue, a strong issue that comes there, that it should not be a political issue. I want you to address this issue where, how do we stop devolution from becoming a political issue, especially when the funds are not, there's no formula, as you say. It then can become a political issue that they are giving more money, say, Nuzumba Malamba Fungwe, instead of this, because they have their stronghold and stuff like that. How do we stop this from happening so that we keep our ball or our eye as Zimbabweans on development instead of political bickering, as Chiera says?
Thanks, Blessed. I think that's an important question that we need to address. Let me start, Blessing, by saying we can never divorce devolution from politics. Politics is about who gets what, when, and who. So we can never divorce it. But we have a national framework, which is the Constitution, that has disciplined that. So the Constitution has already disciplined the politics. And the Constitution has already said, go and do this. So what we need to do at the moment is we need to implement the Constitution. The Constitution is very clear. It is the supreme law of the land. And all of us are following the Constitution. So in terms of how we deal with the politics, is we deal with the politics by implementing the Constitution. So the Constitution has already given us broad parameters on what we ought to do. And has given the legislature the function to then create the subsidiary legislation. In this instance, what Chiera was explaining, and so on. So my view is that at the moment, we do not need anyone to define devolution. Devolution has already been defined in the Constitution, and the Constitution ought to be adhered to. Let me end, Blessing, by saying one of the critical things which some of us have been advocating for since the enactment of the Constitution in 2013 is that we now need to align local governance sector legislation to the same Constitution. Whilst the Constitution has given us a broad framework, what we also now need to do is to then align the Urban Councils Act, the Rural District Councils Act, which, for instance, does not give sufficient a power to citizens, a consultative power to citizens. So when a councillor conducts councillor feedback meetings, it is on their own free will. It is not legislated. So what we need to do as we consolidate the devolution conversation, we now need to speedily align the local governance sector legislation to the Constitution, and I've spoken about them. So I think over and above what Chiera has said, I think we can add that, and I think we can continue this conversation, fine-tune where we fine-tune, calibrate where we recalibrate, and I'm sure we should be able to attain what was envisaged in the 2013 Constitution on Devolution.
No, thank you very much for these amazing insights. This was the situation right now where we were discussing the aspects of devolution, locating the people in development of their own constituencies, in their own provinces, in their own homes, in their own areas. Vanhu vari kuramba kuudzirwa. They want to be able to decide and determine what is important for them in their own localities and ensure that they are responsible for their future. And I had an amazing cast in studio here discussing this very important issue aspect. You have a responsibility for the development of the area where you come from. It is your responsibility to engage your local leaders, to engage with the legislature so that the laws that allow you to have that freedom to develop your own communities are put in place. Parliament, by its nature, its role, parliamentarians, their role is not to be buying you meal and bringing them to rallies, but it is to be making laws that enable you to develop yourselves and your own communities. And you have to make sure that they do that for your benefit. Now, this is the situation right now in partnership with COTRAD, and I am your host as always, Dara Blessed Mhlanga. Until next time, thank you very much.